But today we have with us Jim Curry, who's a professor of political science at the University of Utah. His articles about Congress have appeared in many of the top journals of political science, and he's the author of two books, Legislating in the Dark, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, and The Limits of Party, which was co-authored with Francis Lee, also published by the University of Chicago in 2020. Jim's work has also appeared in many media outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Atlantic magazine, and he's provided testimony to the U.S. House of Representatives. Jim received his PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland in 2011, and he previously worked on Capitol Hill in the offices of Representative Daniel Lipinski and the House Appropriations Committee. Join me now in welcoming Jim Curry to the Foley Institute. I should also say, I think this is his second time here. So
yeah,
he's a frequent flyer.
Yeah, I'm back. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I wanted to thank the Foley Institute for, having me back so I can talk about Congress again with you all. Congress, which is everyone's favorite topic because everybody loves Congress. What I'm here to talk to you about today is what to expect in the next Congress, in the upcoming 119th Congress. Now in presidential election years like this one, we typically focus our attention on the presidency, the race for the White House. But there are also more than 450 congressional races going on right now too, and they'll decide who controls the country's primary lawmaking apparatus for the next 2 years. So I'm going to start out by walking you all through the state of the 2024 elections, the congressional elections, where do things stand right now, what outcomes are more or less likely in November, and then after that we'll turn to thinking through the coming Congress by looking back at recent Congresses and what we can take away from them about what to expect to happen, what can we expect will or won't get accomplished, what will the new congressional majority, whoever's in power come January, what will they achieve? All right, so where do things stand right now? Well, from a macro perspective, it's really anyone's game in terms of control of the House and the Senate. The race for both chambers is really tight, and at the moment we'd probably say the Democrats may have a very, very slight edge in trying to win the race for control of the House of Representatives. However, Republicans have an even better chance of taking control of the U.S. Senate. On the other hand, if you're a gambling person, the smart money is to bet that both chambers flip, which is sort of an interesting thing that has not occurred much in modern American history. But regardless of who gets the majority in each chamber, the number one thing you should expect is that the margins of control are going to be extremely tight. Neither party is going to have a large majority on either side of the Capitol. So let's take a closer look at the Senate. Going into this election, Democrats controlled 51 seats, counting all the various independents that presently caucus with them, which is at this point 4, which is a lot. And the Republicans control 49 seats. The built-in advantage for the Republicans is that Democratic incumbents are defending twice as many seats as are the Republicans. With the 1/3 of the Senate that goes up each time, this time around we have 22 seats presently held by Democrats that are up and just 11 seats presently held by Republicans that are up. This gives Republicans twice as many opportunities to pick up seats. It's just very simple math. And it forces Democrats to have to play defense twice as much and have fewer opportunities to pick up seats themselves. This is how most political prognosticators see the state of play for those races right now. And these specific classifications come from Real Clear Politics, which primarily just looks at polling to give us a sense of where the races stand. Right now, 39 seats are seen as either safe for the Democrats or they're not up, and another 47 are safe for the Republicans or not up for re-election. As you look, so that's already, a deficit. The Republicans walk into this election like baseline, even if everything went as bad as it could realistically go, they'll still have 47 seats. So you only need 3 more to get to 50 and 4 to get to 51. That's versus starting at 45 for the Democrats, or starting at 37 for the Democrats, or 39. But as you look farther, things get even more challenging for the Democrats. Among the races that are seen as toss-ups, 4 out of the 5 are currently seats held by Democratic incumbents. Just one, Rick Scott in Florida, which is classified as a toss-up seat, is the only one that's being held by a Republican, and I think it's probably not that competitive. Some of the polling shows it's on the closer side, but it's very likely that that's a lot of polling error going on there. Even worse for the Democrats, one of their incumbents, John Tester, is in a race that most people expect is like leaning towards the GOP. Not a situation where John Tester is definitely going to lose, but a situation where he's definitely fighting against headwinds. And beyond that, too, we also have a state like Maryland, a pretty dark blue state that's suddenly competitive because of the candidates. But the biggest challenge for the Democrats is that one of their current seats is already seen as lost. This is Joe Manchin's seat in West Virginia. With Manchin not running for re-election, Republican Jim Justice is expected to basically take this in a walk. And in fact, the polling averages right now have Justice at 62% and his opponent just at 28%. West Virginia being one of the most Republican states in the Union at the time. This essentially puts the Republicans already at 50 seats you'd expect them to get. They're already there. Democrats would have to sweep every other race, every other even marginally competitive race, including by holding all of the ones that lean Democratic, winning all the toss-ups, and holding on in Montana to break even at 50-50 and maybe control the Senate if they also win the presidency. Otherwise, it seems relatively certain that if the Democrats lose even one more race, this is a Republican-controlled Senate going into 2025. Now what about the House? On the House side, things are less bleak for the Democrats. In fact, they might be slight favorites here to win control. Right now in the current Congress, Republicans control 220 seats, while the Democrats control 212, and there's a few empty seats. There are about 32 serious toss-up races, and the Democrats might have an edge here, with a lot of these races taking place in places like New York and Michigan and elsewhere, places where the Democrats have generally done well in modern history, but underperformed in 2022 a little bit. So if you're expecting a little bit of a bounce back where Democrats do not disastrously fall on their face in some of these New York State races, and you only need to pick up 4 or 5 seats to take the majority, you might expect like, well, there's slight favorites there, but it's far from a sure thing. The biggest thing that points to the Democrats being in a better position is this generic ballot polling, where people are asked, do you plan to vote for the Democratic or Republican candidate in your district in this coming election? And the Democrats have a 2-point edge in the generic poll. 2 years ago, Republicans had a 2-point edge and they narrowly won the House. This would suggest that Democrats are probably in a position where they should be seen as slight favorites to win back control of the House of Representatives. But whichever party wins the House or the Senate is almost certainly going to have a very small majority. That's the one thing we can be very, very, very certain about for both chambers. This graph shows the percent of seats controlled by the majority party in the House of Representatives over time. Particularly important here is this modern period from 1995 through the present. This is what Francis Lee calls the period of insecure majorities, our period, where not only is control of the House constantly up for grabs, but the winner has typically had historically small majorities when they win. In fact, since 2021, in the last 2 Congresses, what we've seen is that neither party has been able to manage larger than a 5-seat majority in the House of Representatives. That is just historically small. And this is likely to continue next year. It's hard to imagine the Democrats would be able to pull off more than a 4 to 5-seat majority, maybe a 6-seat majority if everything goes great. The situation is largely the same in the Senate. In fact, the last 2 Congresses saw first a 50-50 split between the Democrats and Republicans, and now a 51-49 split. And it's hard to imagine that it will be much different from that. Neither party has had more than a 3-seat majority going all the way back to 2017 at this point. These things are unlikely to change. So in other words, no matter who wins and who loses, no matter who takes control in each chamber, the basic realities of narrow majorities are unlikely to change. We're going to have a narrow majority in the House, a narrow majority in the Senate. Divided government is extremely likely, which means power sharing. When you have that narrow of a majority, when it's very likely that you have Democrats controlling some of our institutions and Republicans controlling others, they're going to have to work together if they want to get things done. So this brings us to the next Congress. What should we expect? Well, perhaps more precisely, whether we find Democrats or Republicans winning in this November and taking control, what can we expect that they will actually be able to accomplish with the power that they've won? Well, perhaps one of the most important things to know about Congress and about Washington in general is that when parties run for election, when they win and when they take charge, they inevitably promise people the moon and the stars. In other words, they come into power with these big, bold plans, promising big, bold change to long-standing issues. Every 2 years, in fact, at this point, we are treated to election campaigns in which each side offers up lengthy and ambitious, detailed plans about what they're going to do and how they're going to change the world. That if they tell us that if we would just put them in charge, they will pass groundbreaking legislation that solves all kinds of societal problems. But invariably, every Congress and every party majority comes in and under-delivers on these lofty promises. So consider the Republicans in the most recent Congress. The Republicans won control of the House of Representatives in the 2022 midterms and took control with a very lengthy agenda. In fact, they detailed this agenda ahead of time, and then they put that agenda into practice as they set their policy priorities at the start of the Congress. Among other things, they promised to reduce federal spending, particularly on domestic non-defense programs, and in fact, they set out to try to reduce it quite a bit, as much as 20 or 25%, and thereby cutting down the federal deficit. In particular, they wanted to really slash away at new funding for the IRS that had been put in place by the Democrats in the Biden administration under their Inflation Reduction Act. They also wanted to pass ambitious energy legislation that would roll back most of the green energy programs that had been put in place by Biden and the Democrats, and also streamline the process for approval of permitting for new energy projects. They wanted to pass border security legislation that would restrict asylum, restart the building of a border wall, and so on. They wanted to pass what they called a Parents' Bill of Rights that gave parents more access to and influence over public school programming and curriculum in their districts. They wanted to beef up American economic competition in China by passing a number of laws that would put tougher trade restrictions on China or beef up our own companies in the competition with Chinese companies. They wanted to eliminate federal funding for any insurance plans that cover abortion. They wanted to pass, vaguely, but they wanted to pass laws that would broadly support law enforcement. They wanted to investigate and rein in and probably impeach more than one person in the Biden administration. And they wanted to end all the COVID-era congressional processes, things like proxy voting and remote hearings and committee meetings that had characterized the prior couple Congresses. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of things that you want to do. But this is not unusual at all for a new congressional majority these days. In 2020, Democrats had just as large and ambitious of a list, perhaps even longer, just as they also had when they took control of the House of Representatives in 2018, and just as the Republicans had when they took control of the House, Senate, and White House after the 2016 elections. Parties do this all the time. We wanted to know something about whether or not they actually succeed at these efforts. To do that, Francis Lee and I, for our books, The Limits of Party, collected data on every stated agenda priority of every new majority party in the House or the Senate since 1985. We then took stock of whether, on each item, the majority was able to achieve most of what it set out to achieve, passing a law that reflected its stated goals, whether it achieved just some of what it wanted on each item, passing a new law, but one that only achieved some of what it set out to do, or whether it did nothing on an item, failing to pass a new law at all that took any movement in shaping public policy. We found that parties sometimes succeed, but failure is the most common. In fact, on about 50% of the 295 agenda priorities that we categorized, we found that the majority just simply failed to advance legislation, pass a new law. On another 31%, they passed a new law, but it clearly fell short of their stated ambitions. So we're left with just 19% on which the majority succeeded to enact its policy priorities into law. So depending on your perspective, that may sound pretty good. Oh, 19% could be worse. It certainly could be worse. It's about 1 out of 5. But if you really start digging into this 19%, it turns out it's a lot less impressive than it may sound at first. As we looked into it, a lot of the items were things that were proposed by the majority that already had widespread support across party lines, sort of low-hanging fruit. We want to come into power and show we can govern, so we're going to pass this thing that was probably going to pass anyway, and we're going to say it's a party priority. Or it's things that Congress would have to do anyway. Oh, we need to reauthorize surface transportation dollars. We're going to make that a priority for this coming Congress. But these things are not controversial. These things are expected. These things are things that would have happened regardless of who was in control. So when we looked more closely, we could only find 13 things out of 295 that we would characterize as essentially big wins for either party. These are items on which the majority proposed something that reflected long-standing party goals. They came into power, they pushed for it, they achieved more or less what they said they wanted to do, and they did so over the sustained opposition of the other side. These are the big partisan victories. This is just 4% of all the things the parties tried to do, not much at all. And even then, if this doesn't seem unimpressive enough to you about what parties can accomplish, even then, when you dig into a lot of these, it's even less impressive than it seems. You have some, like the crime bill from 1994 passed by the Democrats, or the Medicare Modernization Act passed by the Republicans in 2003, that have now become embarrassments to their party. Democrats have to run away from this crime bill. Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden had to apologize for supporting it to Democratic primary voters in order to win the nominations in 2016 and 2020. Same for Republicans with the Medicare Modernization Act, which was at the time the single largest expansion of the federal welfare state, passed by Republicans, that is now seen as an embarrassment that they don't really want to talk about, as they've leaned harder into sort of being anti-entitlement. Other things essentially failed to achieve their aims. The National Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter, works in the sense that when you go get a driver's license, they ask you if you want to vote. But the stated goal of Motor Voter was that this was supposed to result in universal voter registration. Not only has it not resulted in universal voter registration, it has essentially had no impact on voter registration whatsoever, as far as any of the best studies can figure out. Same with pay-as-you-go budget rule, which was passed by the Democrats in 2007, which was supposed to eliminate budget deficits as we know it. Well, it turns out we have larger budget deficits than ever before, and then they repealed the rule. There are things like the Class Action Fairness Act, which are simply underwhelming and nobody remembers much about what they are. There are also things like the Bush's second round tax cuts, or the Dodd-Frank financial reforms put in place by the Democrats, that either never got fully implemented or also, in fact, in both cases, mostly got repealed. You then have things like S-chip expansion in 2009 and the American Rescue Plan, which were big wins, but largely just continued programs that were already on the books. And programs that were already on the books that had been put into place with strong bipartisan support in the first place. So you end up being left with a much less lengthy list of sort of like big policy changes that either party came in and did. These four, essentially. FMLA, which was a really big deal and remains to be a big deal, and Democrats still want to build on it. The Affordable Care Act, Democrats are still pretty happy about that one. Republicans are still satisfied with the tax cuts and tax reforms they did in 2017, and they're very happy that they were able to block a bunch of Obama-era environmental regulations when they first took control of Congress in 2017. But even then, even if you really want to get into it, if you go back in time, those of you who might remember, if you go back in time to discussions around the Affordable Care Act and discussions around the Republicans' tax reform bill, what we got at the end really didn't look that much like what they said. We code these as major victories because they are big, major party-defining victories. But Democrats originally wanted a single-payer federal health care system, and we did not get it. Paul Ryan told me in 2017 that I was going to be able to file my taxes on a postcard. And as my father-in-law reminds me all the time, my CPA father-in-law reminds me, the tax code got more complicated. So they did something big, but it wasn't necessarily what it sounded like at first. So, it may sound like what I'm saying is nothing gets done, but that's not what I'm saying. It's important to remember that even if the parties under-deliver on these ambitious, groundbreaking, big policy change promises, that doesn't mean they don't achieve anything at all. Every 2 years, in fact, Congress passes a substantial amount of new law, more than people realize. Every 2 years, majority claims victories on things that it seeks to achieve in Washington. It just doesn't look like the types of things that we think about as sort of like big partisan victories. This is a lesson that runs contrary to what most of us are told about congressional productivity. We're usually told that Congress gets nothing done. It can't do anything. And that every year they're passing fewer and fewer laws. And this is a conclusion that's driven to some degree about how we count legislation. And indeed, if you simply count the number of bills each Congress over time, that went on and were enacted and became law, it turns out we see a very clear downward trend. Back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, Congress passed more bills into law. Now it passes fewer. However, what these data don't show is that while Congress is passing fewer laws, it's passing longer laws that do more things at once. These things called omnibus laws that essentially are sometimes dozens and dozens of separate laws, separate bills that in the old days would have passed individually, now pass in one big chunk. So instead, if we assess Congress productivity, it's the number of pages of new law that it enacts every 2 years. What we get is a vision where Congress is arguably more productive than it has ever been. It is certainly passing more new laws than it was 60 or 70 years ago in terms of pages, and it's passing at least as much new law as it was back in the 1980s. In fact, the last two Congresses, by this measure, are the most productive Congresses in American history. I bring this up not because counting pages is necessarily better than counting laws, but there's two stories here. It's not so clean and neat to say Congress is doing less. In fact, in some ways of thinking about it, Congress might be doing more. So how is this possible? How is it possible that Congress and the parties on Capitol Hill are getting so much done, given the hyper-partisanship and the gridlock and etc. that seems to characterize our politics today? The answer is very simple. They compromise. We don't recognize anymore that the parties compromise. We don't think that they do. They present an image of themselves as uncompromising to the public because it helps them try to appeal to voters and especially try to rile up hardcore partisan voters and get them to show up and vote on election day. But what Congress does is they largely enact legislation almost solely only when they can build really broad and bipartisan support for passing it. In this fact, this is how Congress has always passed legislation, especially in the modern period. These are two graphs here. They show in the House and the Senate two things. The first, in the white circles, it shows the percent of members of the House and the Senate that supported everything that became law in each of these Congresses from the 1970s through the present. It shows the average each Congress over time. With the black marks, it shows the percent of the members of the minority party in the House and the Senate that voted in favor of all the new things that passed on average in each Congress. If you've been told that the parties no longer work together or that bipartisanship is dead, these data might surprise you. As it turns out, we've had almost no change in the House of Representatives in the amount of members of the House, the percentage of members of the House that are supporting things that become law, and we've had almost no change. In fact, if anything, we've had an increase in the minority party, the opposition party, voting for the things that become law on Capitol Hill. It's largely the same story in the Senate. Back in the 70s, 80-90% of members of the House and the Senate voted in support of things that became law, and about 60 to 70 to 80% of members of the minority party vote in favor of things that become law. You get a little bit more variation in the Senate in recent years, in part because they simply vote on fewer things, hence that fewer laws, more pages. So it just takes one or two laws that have less overwhelming support for that thing to fly up and down from Congress to Congress. But even in the worst Congresses, these three here that seem to be perhaps the most partisan, you still have about half of the minority party in the Senate on average supporting things that become law. That's quite a bit. That's quite a bit of bipartisan support for people who apparently never worked together. Even today, the pathways to success for majority parties lie primarily in cultivating bipartisan support. In our book, among other things, Francis Lee and I also categorize the different paths the majority took in Washington to obtain the legislative successes they did on their priorities. And we found there are essentially four pathways to victory, four pathways to success. The first is to seek broad support for proposals. This typically involves either putting forth really popular policy proposals on key agenda items, or otherwise seeking to find out what can actually get bipartisan support on the issue they're interested in, and then writing a bill to pass that. Another approach is to back down, or in other words, the party may start out by laying out this very ambitious proposal, but they back off or drop some of the more contentious or controversial aspects of their initial proposal in order to try to build support across party lines. Another pathway we call a bipartisan log roll. In these instances, the majority doesn't adjust the contents of their proposal, but negotiates with the other party to pair it up with something something the other party wants too. Something that neither side finds totally objectionable, but may not be super excited about, and they pass them both. And then finally, the only one that represents any form of party-driven success in this sense, any sort of hardball policymaking by the majority, is what we call the steamroll. And these are instances in which the majority finds a way to pass exactly what they wanted over the opposition of the other party. We took these categorized and we categorized all of the majority party legislative efforts from 1985 to 2022, the 148 successes specifically, the 50% where they did achieve a success, and we categorized each as which pathway did they take or which pathways, because a small number of them seem to combine or incorporate multiple pathways together, though most of them, the majority essentially took one. Either they sought broad support or they backed down or what have you. What we found is that the parties overwhelmingly succeed by finding ways to cultivate support for their ideas from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. By far the most common approach is for the majority party to back down. They come in with a big, broad proposal, they lay it out in a lot of detail, they'll often introduce a bill that does all the things that they said they want to do. If they control the House of Representatives, sometimes they'll pass it through the House and be like, yeah, we did it, ignoring the reality that this will go nowhere in the Senate and might get vetoed by a president. But then they back off the controversial proposals, they negotiate with the other party, they find out what's acceptable, and eventually they pass that. The second most common was seeking broad support. In other words, they proposed something that already had broad bipartisan support, and they passed that. It's only about 14% that you can categorize as a steamroll. Not very many. In fact, as we came up with these categories by interviewing people on Capitol Hill and asking them to walk us through the pathways. How do they achieve success until we came up with some fairly clear categories. The really interesting thing is that this one never came up in the interviews. People on Capitol Hill find this sort of approach is so unlikely to be useful that they expect that this will generally fail, whereas they see the other pathways as things that actually can lead to success, that it didn't even occur to them until we asked them, well, what about this one? They're like, oh yeah, every once in a while we get lucky, basically. We also find that none of these approaches have changed in terms of how frequently they're used over time. Congress isn't steamrolling more, isn't backing down more, isn't seeking broad support more. It's just kind of the same. It fluctuates from Congress to Congress, but you get a whole lot of flat lines in terms of how things are done. It hasn't changed. Congress still has to approach, and the parties still have to approach trying to achieve their goals in the same ways that they did way back in the 1980s. Way back. When you get down to it, steamrolls are neither common nor necessarily represent all the biggest things that Congress has ever done in recent decades either. That's often a response that we get when we show this is like, oh yeah, they do a lot of stuff, but the big stuff, that's the stuff where they steamroll. Well, not really. If you get into it, like there's some of the big things are steamrolls, but some of them aren't. Some of them, and they also look very different in a lot of ways. There are 19 total steamrolls, essentially, which reflect a lot of that same list of the big victories, with some other things. But even then, just 10 of them were things that were enacted over the opposition of the other party. That's these 10. The rest are things that the majority wanted to do, the minority didn't like it, but they essentially capitulated. You essentially have situations where, for whatever reason, usually because of political pressure, the opposition party stopped opposing it and they said, fine, you can have it. And these are a lot of interesting cases. It's things like the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which advanced policies on job discrimination based on especially on gender and race. And this was stymied in Congress for a long time. Democrats have been pushing this for years at this point, after a series of Supreme Court cases in the 80s that seemed to reduce protections for job discrimination based on race and gender. And it was only after the disastrous Anita Hill hearings in which members of Congress came across as pretty sexist in a lot of ways that Republicans were like, maybe we shouldn't keep doing things that make us look this bad, and they just let it pass. You have a lot of stuff, if you'll notice, from this same period here, from 02 to 03 to 04 to 05 to 06, all centered around the war on terror, where Democrats were not terribly enthusiastic about finishing a missile defense program that they've been opposing for 20 years, or increasing military funding to a great degree, or passing these massive billion-dollar war supplementals, but they also found it to be politically untenable to oppose the war on terror and the war in Iraq at that period, so they just let it go by. These are a lot of interesting cases where it's not even really just like these big partisan victories where the majority found a way to work around the minority. It's the minority sort of gave up the fight. So, what should we take away from all this? And what should we think about as we look to the next Congress? Well, though majority parties are so deeply constrained in their ability to pass exactly what they want, they still legislate. But they do so most of the time by seeking to pass things that can earn bipartisan support, and by approaching the other side and entering into negotiations in good faith about what can we work together to agree to pass and move things forward. One party steamrolling the other is simply not a very common way that legislative victories happen, even though that is exactly how these parties and their members and their leaders talk about what they're going to do in the next Congress as they're running to try to take control. Right now, what you have is party leaders, both presidential candidates and congressional leaders, talking about put us in power and we will do this, and we will do this, and we will do this, and we will do this. And guess what? They won't. They want to, but they can't, because the system makes it a little hard to achieve all your hopes and dreams. Let's look one more time at the Republicans' priorities for the current Congress. These are the 10 things that the new House majority wanted to accomplish. But so far, their rate of success has not been great. And they have a couple months to go, so maybe they can turn it all around between now and Christmas. Seems unlikely. They'll probably pass a couple things that haven't passed yet, but I don't think all of a sudden the Democrats are going to say, you know what, have what you want. On 6 of the 10 items, they do not appear to be on track for success at all. They have not been able to produce any substantial cuts to overall federal spending. In fact, despite 2 years of painstaking negotiations that were so fraught that they fired the Speaker of the House at one point in time, federal spending actually went up. They have not been able to move out through the House. They were able to move their energy legislation, their Parent Bill of Rights, and their law enforcement bills, but all of these have been completely stymied in the Senate and have gone nowhere. A bipartisan border security proposal that contained a lot of what conservatives said and that they hoped to accomplish died after former President Trump came out in opposition to it. And legislation on abortion essentially didn't even get brought up on the House floor because Republican leaders suddenly got gun shy about taking action on an issue that seems to be working against them in elections. On a couple of things they've had more success. One of the biggest achievements they got out of their budget and appropriations negotiations with the Biden White House was an agreement that they would slash IRS funding. So they've accomplished that. In fact, they did it twice, once in 2023 and once in 2024. And they did, in fact, end COVID-era congressional processes. There's no more proxy voting. There's no more remote committee hearings and meetings. All these things, they don't have to be masked on the House floor. All these things are gone. That was probably the only steamroll of the 118th Congress for the Republicans, and it's because it's the type of thing where they don't actually have to get approval from the House and the Senate and the White House. They just took a simple majority vote on the floor of the House and it changed the House's procedures. These other things, improving economic competition with China, investigating and raiding the Biden administration, don't look good, but I'll reserve judgment because there's still time, or maybe they could pass. They have all these bills on economic competition that they started to work through the House. We'll see what happens in the lame duck after November. And I guess they could still impeach Biden up until January 20th, so you never know. So where do we go from here? How do we conclude? How do we wrap up what to expect from the 119th Congress? Well, for one, lawmakers in Washington have long known that compromise is the key in Washington, and that's not going to change. Lawmakers now know it, and lawmakers a generation ago knew it. This is a quote from Richard Bolling, that compromise is the name of the game in the legislative process. Very few bills become laws and still retain more of what 50 or to 75% of what their authors originally envisioned. Or you have Howard Baker, who was a key Republican leader in Congress for a long time. It's a paradox of sorts. People come here with ideals, and this place reinforces their ideals, and the Congress is an institution of compromises, and that's the antithesis of idealism. We've known this forever. And for some reason we think it's changed because the parties are more ambitious and partisan in their messaging, but it hasn't changed the fundamentals of lawmaking. And that's what we tend to miss. So I think what you'd expect is, just like every Congress before it, whoever takes power in the 119th Congress is going to have wild dreams about what they're going to accomplish in it, but you should expect they are not going to achieve their wildest ambitions. They will do some things. They will enact some policies. If there's unified party government, you should expect the party to be able to tick off one or two pretty clean victories, but largely either fail or have to compromise heavily on the rest. If you have divided government, you can basically assume that neither party will achieve anything in the pure form that they wish, because they have to share power with each other, and compromise will be the only way forward. However, you should expect that they will do more than you expect. Every year, I hear this from talking to people that, we have divided government, they're going to fight too much, nothing will happen. Things will happen. In fact, surprising things will happen. In fact, this December, before the new Congress even comes in, some surprising things will probably happen. Because usually at the very end, like all of us, we often put off our work till the very last minute. They will, in December, end the fight that they've been having over some of these items that have been worked on for 2 years. They will agree that this is what we can move forward, this is what we'll agree to, we'll back it, and they'll pass it as parts of these big omnibus bills attached to the spending legislation, attached to the defense authorization, attached to these big must-pass bills, and it'll be there. But it won't look like anything that they initially set out to do. It'll be deeply compromised from there. And that's been the case forever, and that's going to be the case in the next Congress, regardless of who wins and who loses. So, thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, for Q&A. Maybe I'll start. One thing you didn't talk about at all was the filibuster.
Yeah.
What happens if the filibuster gets eliminated?
So my view on the filibuster is, and so this is something that Francis and I looked into too, because we also categorize all the reasons why they failed as well, which is not something I covered today. And the filibuster is one of these categories of things failed because it was filibustered by the other side. It turned out it's probably about 20% of failures are caused by the filibuster. So there's some things that would probably pass that otherwise wouldn't pass. That would have been true in past Congresses too, but not as many, given how much attention the filibuster gets, probably not as much as people think. There's a lot of things where the filibuster becomes actually a shield for things that people in the majority don't even really want to do, but their voters want. And so because they know it's going to fail, like the Democratic or Republican majority in the Senate will bring it to the floor and let the other side kill it by voting against cloture. And then they can be like, it wasn't us. And this becomes a tell sometimes when they have to vote it under procedures. So the best example I ever saw was Democrats spent a lot of time messaging about increasing the federal minimum wage in the 2020 elections, right? And then there was an opportunity via amendment to attach a $15 minimum wage to the American Rescue Plan, and 9 different Senate Democrats voted against it along with all the Republicans. Up until that point, Senate Democrats have been bringing these minimum wage bills to the floor, voting for them and letting Republicans kill it, and being like, it's their fault. But when it turns out when it was actually possible, a lot of the Democrats didn't want it either, especially those from like lower cost of living states where they thought that a $15 minimum wage would be too high. So I think it could make some difference. The filibuster is going to go away at some point. They've been whittling away at it since the minute they created it. But I also would temper anyone's expectations that this will change everything. Some stuff will pass that wouldn't have, but a lot of stuff will still fail because there's so many other checks and balances that make it so hard for one party to do what it wants to do.
So while we see a maintenance of bipartisan support within Congress, I think it's difficult to deny the growing division both in rhetoric and among voters. So do you think this is indicative of Congress being less representative of their constituencies over time?
I don't think it's that they're less representative. Because I think you're right, you're absolutely right. There's way more partisanship before rhetorically, the public seems more divided. But I think what Congress has done is they've tried to walk this delicate tightrope or try to have it do it both ways, where they then go out and message and engage in rhetoric and attack each other to give voice to those divisions. But then at the end of the day, they have to recognize that well, our choice is not pass things that our hardcore partisans want or not. It's really just we can't pass what our hardcore supporters want because it's too difficult, and you have to build this broad support with all our checks and balances. And so we'll give them the red meat through rhetoric and through this and that. We'll take messaging votes on the floor, but then we're going to have to compromise. And they have a hard time with that, though, right? Because they don't feel like they get much mileage out of the compromise. They don't talk about it. A lot of times you see that they'll pass these big things and no one will say a word. It's just like very quiet, which isn't necessarily great for Congress's public, standing with the public. But they do that for the very reason you bring up, is that they're trying to give voice as representatives while still be responsible policymakers. So I don't know that makes them less representative. I think it's just them trying to bend to both realities at the same time. If that makes sense. Yeah.
How much would you say the use of unorthodox methods, let's say the decline of conference committees in Congress, have to do with the perception that Congress is doing less?
Perception, a lot. Because you don't get the same, I don't think it's just that. But I do think the fact that you have less, very on display public lawmaking occurring. They don't have these long debates on the House and Senate floor. They don't have all these amendments. They don't do conference committees. They don't even do as many committee markups. So there's less of that to write about in the media. It means that it looks like they're just doing nothing because it's all taking place in negotiations behind the scenes. So I think it does, but I also don't want to just solely blame Congress for that, because I think the media has also leaned more into not covering policymaking on Capitol Hill. If you go back and read old newspaper clippings, you kind of be shocked by how much detail there is just about the day-to-day grind of stuff happening on Capitol Hill. And they don't cover that at all because it doesn't generate clicks. It doesn't generate views on social media. They lean into these sensationalist stories that highlight the disagreements and sort of sweep away all the stuff that's happening. But I do think it has contributed because it's harder to see it. And when you can't see Congress at work, you might easily just believe they're not at work. So yeah.
So I got a question. What you look at is legislation, but another function of Congress is to oversee the executive. And it seems to me there's a long-term trend of giving up power here to the executive branch, but it's getting worse in terms of because of partisanship and the entrenched partisanship. So now, even though the president may be impeached in the House, he won't be convicted in the Senate because of partisanship, right? Or same thing with oversight and hearings about confirmation hearings of judges, administration officials. Do you see that changing, the role of Congress in its oversight of the executive branch changing?
Yeah, I think it's shifted a lot more than anything. You're right. If you have a Republican president and a Republican Senate or Republican Congress, they will not hammer their own president in formal public ways. They will not have investigatory hearings that bring these things to light in public. They will a lot of times do it behind the scenes, or they'll sort of try to stymie something the president isn't a little bit more quietly. They both have gotten better at this sort of team play aspect of politics, where it's you don't formally you don't do anything to make your side look bad. You make them sound good. On the flip side, you're it seems like impeachment has just become another partisan tool when you have divided government, where we've had now impeachments every single Congress now for several Congresses, or attempts at it. But for instance, with nominations, during the Republican and Trump era, where Trump was president and the Republicans controlled the Senate, they wouldn't hold hearings on the nominees that came from Trump that they thought were just truly abhorrent. They wouldn't even hold a hearing, because then they would have to be in this position of criticizing this person that Trump wanted. So instead, they would just never get around to scheduling it and hope that Trump got the hint. We're not going to consider this guy. And so it's a quiet way of saying no. But that's not necessarily great, because then you don't get the public display, which should be a big part of investigatory hearings, is Congress bringing things to light, the public being able to digest that and form opinions around it. Instead, they just kind of this. Let's just all pretend this never happened. So I think what it's really taken away is you can think back in past decades where you had these big bipartisan investigatory hearings about things, and those seem by and large, they're gone.
That's what I was thinking about. We couldn't have the Watergate hearings
Yeah.
today.
No, it would turn into Republicans would just probably, or Democrats, if it was a Democratic president, would just not participate, which is what we saw with the January 6th commission. They were either going to appoint, like, if Kevin McCarthy had been in charge of appointing Republicans to that commission, he's going to appoint people who, like, might have been, low-key complicit in the January 6th riots. And so Nancy Pelosi didn't let him, and so what you get is a very, like, one-sided looking, like, thing. Like, it's hard to envision many of these things functioning like they did, especially if it involves a president, because everyone's so protective of their own president. So, yeah. Yes?
So how much would you, like, for example, say like impeachment processes would also follow your legislative successes? Like the Watergate hearings were done with the expectation of no impeachment would be done.
Yeah.
But it was kind of like but over time people built a communal trust with one another that impeachment became much more likely. Would you say that, let's say, impeachment hearings could also follow similar patterns to your bipartisanship?
Well, they've definitely become less
Yeah.
bipartisan. Because I think it's just become this like tool,
Mhm.
right? And I think there was some resistance to that by like some in the Democratic leadership during the Trump years. Like Pelosi famously did not want to do this, like up until she felt like her hand was forced to begin impeachment proceedings, because that is exactly what she was afraid of. She did not want her party to fall into the debacle that Republicans did in the 90s with Clinton, where it came across as this just partisan exercise, even though she had her own private reservations that she thought what Trump did was probably quite wrong. And so she put it off, but like by then finally having to do it and then doing it again, and now the House Republicans like trying to do like this like aborted impeachment attempt of Biden, it's like turned it into like, this is by and large mostly just a very partisan exercise, which is probably quite concerning because it's supposed to be an actual thing. It's supposed to be one of the few things Congress can do to really hold members of the other branches accountable. And if it just turns into something that is de facto a partisanship thing, like a congressional hearing, then like that's potentially troubling unless somebody can walk back from that ledge. But like at this point, I'd expect whoever wins the White House in November, if if the other party controls the House, they're going to try to impeach them at some point. They may fail. Like House Republicans did not succeed. They did their whole investigation of Biden, put forth this report. They planned originally to go through their impeachment, and then the report wasn't as explosive as they wanted, so they kind of like had a little press release, and they're like, I guess he's not really president anyway, because he's not awake. And it's like, and like they just kind of quietly buried it because they felt like they didn't have the juice or the votes in their own party to do it. But this is what it's turned into, and that's probably one of the more concerning things as far as I'm concerned.
Time for one or two more questions?
Okay, so if we assume, based on the data that you presented, that that's an indicator that Congress is actually running as an institution as it ought to, right, in Democratic. How do we square that with other indicators of Democratic backsliding in America?
Because I don't think the backsliding has anything to do with the legislature.
Okay.
Right. I think there are real things to be concerned about with the election administration and things like that. Like, I would not quibble or argue there. Like, and I think there's a lot of problematic aspects of our politics at the moment. I just think Congress is, because it's so difficult to do anything, in a funny way sort of gets insulated from that. Because it's hard for people who want to, like, who might want to use Congress as a tool for disenfranchisement or like consolidating power in certain parts of the government. Well, it turns out it's like you have a hard time getting 80% of the Congress. Like you think about it, like say Congressional Republicans want, Trump wins and Congressional Republicans want to give him all this power. You're not going to get most of the Democrats are going to be like, right, sure, yeah, let's give that guy, we like that guy. They're going to say no, and then it's not going to go anywhere, right? And so like the weird way Congress functions kind of insulates it from those problems, but things like the way our elections are running, I think that's a different story.
So, sorry,
Yeah.
what would have to happen for Congress as an institution to no longer be resilient to those types of?
You would need a thing that's been really rare in American history, which is one side having truly massive majorities that are unified behind wanting to do something, which is something we have not seen since FDR, But even then, when FDR got to a point of like wanting to like pack the courts because he was dissatisfied with the checks and balances system, it was members of his own party that pushed back. And so like, but that's what it would take, because you would need to have so much support from just one side and a willingness to do the thing that the other side can't actually fight back. And that's been so rare. Like there are no other times in American history other than the New Deal and the Civil War where one side held 70-80% of the seats. So like in some ways, even though it's really frustrating to have these narrow majorities, and it has a lot of like corrosive impacts on like how nasty our politics are, in a way,
Normatively, it could be kind of good.
you can see the upside of like,
Yeah.
as well, it's been hard for anyone to do anything that's like really bad too, which is exactly what people like James Madison and John Adams wanted, was it'd be nice if the government did good things, but it's even better if it doesn't do bad things. That's kind of like their attitude, and that's what we got.
Okay, time for one more question.
Should we anticipate more, potential infighting for speakerships?
Yeah. If the Democrats win either chamber, no. They seem, at the moment, satisfied with their leaders. Ask me again in 2 years, that can change. If the Republicans win, yes. It's hard to envision a scenario where Mike Johnson doesn't get challenged by somebody. As far as I'm concerned, it seems like Steve Scalise has been running for the job from the minute he didn't get it last fall. He's been out fundraising Mike Johnson and then like talking about it as loud as he can, which is something you only do if you want to be Speaker of the House. And he's kind of mad that someone else from his own state he got passed over for another person from Louisiana. In the Senate, it's going to be a brawl, like among the Republicans, regardless of whether they win the chamber or not. Because with McConnell retiring, there's no consensus about who the next leader should be. Today, you had Senator Mike Lee put out a list of demands that he thought, like, whoever the new Republican leader should agree to, much like the Chip Roys and the Freedom Caucus types did in the House 2 years ago. It's extremely reminiscent. And so I think you should expect another brawl, unless somehow the Republicans are like wildly successful in the House and then they like give Johnson credit for it. But in all likelihood, they're not wildly successful. They either narrowly hold on to it or they lose the House. And then all of a sudden it's like, we should have done better and we're not super satisfied with you either. And so I think on the Republican side, you should expect these like leadership battles to continue for the time being.
Okay, I think our time is up. Let me remind you again, we have Katie Searles next week who'll be talking about media coverage of the campaigns and what they get right and what they get wrong. So join us next week, but join me now in thanking Jim Curry for next year.